Hello everyone, welcome to the 6th KK chess series. Previously, we talked about the basic rules of chess and some simple checkmates. Now we're going to move on to studying the openings. Before we do that, let's learn some basic rules that we must follow in the openings. Simply, it's just one rule, and that is make use of every single piece. We'll call it, in a more professional term, developing the pieces. Now, let's look at some common ways that we develop our pieces. To better make use of our pieces, we tend to put them in the middle of the board, the center four squares. Here, the ideal situation is that we put one of our pieces on one of these squares so that it can control the most squares in the board as possible. For example, if we put a bishop over here, the bishop can control in all four directions. That is adding up 13 squares. However, if it is only on the corner or on the side of the board, let's just say it's at the corner, it can only control 7 squares, half times the previous one in the center. Let's take another piece, for example, the knight. When the knight is at the center, it can control 8 squares around it. But if it's only at the corner of the board, it can only control 2. So usually speaking, we would prefer the knight to be at the center. This is similar to other pieces. The rook, the queen, not really the king because we need the protection. We need to protect the king, and the pawn. Usually we would like our pawns, bishops, and knights at the center of the square, simply because this part of the board is pretty hostile, and if you put a piece of very high value, for example the queen, your opponent can simply attack it, for example with a bishop. Then you would have to move your queen away, since you wouldn't want to trade off. So this is one main part of developing the pieces. Another important thing is to remember the castle. That is, usually when the chess pieces are fighting on the board, we would want to protect our king. To do that, we want to bring it to the corner, as far as away from the center as possible. So we would want to castle as soon as possible, bringing our king to the corner and our rook into the battlefield. But usually, it doesn't matter that if we put a king at this square or exactly at the corner. So usually castling is just enough to protect the king. So let's look at an example for beginners. This is how the chessboard is originally set up. Let's look at the example. This opening is called the Italian opening, and it is very logical for beginners. It goes like this. White plays e4, advancing its pawn forward. This allows it to further develop its bishop or the queen and eventually get a castle. Furthermore, it controls the center by just putting a pawn directly in one of the center squares. So black does the same, advances its pawn, lets out its bishop and queen, and eventually castling. This pawn also takes one of the center squares and controls another. The next move white plays is knight f3. This directly attacks the black pawn, also controlling another center square, potentially allowing its pawn to advance to d4. Furthermore, when the bishop develops to somewhere, then white is able to castle. So what does black play? Now black's pawn is under attack. Although we said that the most important thing in the opening is developing pieces, we wouldn't want to give up our pawn. So one approach black can do is to do the same. Also jump this knight to f6 like a mirror and attacks white's pawn. But this may lead to some very complex variations. So today we're going to talk about the most simple way and the most common one played by all levels of players, knight c6. This also develops one of the knights and controls the centers, protects its pawn. Although this is not directly helping black to castle, but black is not in such a hurry. So then, white plays bishop to c4. After these moves, an Italian game is established. White to c4. First, moving the bishop allows white to castle on the next move. Second, the bishop controls one of the center squares, and it aims at black's f7 pawn. Usually this pawn is considered pretty weak since only the king is guarding it. So this square is pretty effective for the white bishop. Next, black does the same. Move this bishop to c5. For the same reasons, controlling the center, attacking white's f2 pawn, developing its pieces, and preparing for castling. Now, white plays knight c3. This also develops one of the knights, controls the centers, and you might ask, why doesn't white just castle directly? Well, castling is one of the options. I would say that knight c3 and castling's order can be interchangeable. It doesn't really matter. Like, white's next move planning is castle. So black mirrors white. Black jumps knight f6, still applying pressure to the center and preparing the castle. Now white castles, getting its king to the the corner for safety. Similarly, black castles, also getting its king to the corner. Then white would like to develop its black square bishop, but we see that it is blocked by two of the pawns. Usually say we would like to develop our bishop in this direction because there are much more squares to go to. So we advance this pawn. We couldn't advance this two squares because black would simply capture it. Black has three pieces attacking this d4 square, and white has only two pieces defending it. So 3 is greater than 2. Black would eventually win this capturing. So let's just play it out. Black captures, white captures, black keeps on capturing, white captures, black captures. White lost a pawn and a knight and a queen in this process. However, black only lost a pawn and a knight. This favors black, so white shouldn't make this trade. Therefore, white will choose to advance its pawn for 1 squares. Although it is not directly placed in one of the center squares, it supports one of its pawns in the center, also potentially supporting its bishop. But most importantly, it lets out its black square bishop. So similarly, black does the same. We see that for every white's and black's move, it applies to the fundamental reason we've talked about, developing pieces. Now the next move, white has many choices. It can put its bishop here, offering a trade with black's bishop, or put the bishop over here, pinning the black's knight. We will talk about what pinning exactly is, but you can just understand that putting the bishop here attacks black's knight, which is pretty useful. Also, white can simply move its bishop up 1 squares. This is often played by advanced players who wants to avoid a draw. Like putting the bishop at e3, offering a trade, sometimes would simplify the position and would eventually lead to a draw. Putting a bishop to g5 is played by too much players, so white may not take advantage. Now these three squares are pretty good choices for white. And similarly, after white developed its black square bishop, black can develop its white square bishop using the similar methods. Next, since most of the pieces are developed, we see that the king, knights, and bishops are already developed. And the rook and queen do not have any useful squares, as we said that the fundamental reason is to develop the pieces, put them in useful squares, and that is usually in the center, but not necessarily. We see that there are no useful squares for the rooks and the queens yet, so they're considered pretty developed at their original place. Now we've finished the opening part of the game and moves on to the middle game. We will talk about it in some few series later. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and if you really like it, please follow.